If he finds you tonight, he won't stop. The words echoed in Emily Carter's mind as rain slammed against her windshield, each drop blurring the road ahead into streaks of light and shadow while her hands tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles pale, breath uneven, the soft sound of her 4-year-old son sleeping in the back seat the only thing anchoring her to reality as she drove through empty streets at nearly 40 miles per hour, not caring where she was going as long as it was away from him, away from Ryan, because leaving had never been the problem, staying gone was. And tonight felt different, heavier, like something had already shifted in ways she couldn't yet understand. She pulled into the dimly lit parking lot behind the restaurant where she worked double shifts just to keep the lights on in her tiny apartment, the neon sign flickering above casting a weak red glow across the wet pavement as she turned off the engine and sat there for a second too long, listening, waiting, her heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else until she forced herself to move, stepping out into the cold night air, rain soaking through her thin jacket almost instantly as she hurried to the back door, glancing over her shoulder once, twice, 3 times, expecting headlights, expecting footsteps, expecting him, but the lot stayed empty, silent, and that silence somehow felt worse. Inside, the warmth hit her all at once, along with the clatter of dishes and low murmur of conversations, the normalcy almost disorienting as if the world hadn't just been falling apart moments ago. Emily wiped her hands on her apron, forcing her breathing to steady, forcing her face into something that looked like calm, because she had learned how to survive like this, how to exist between fear and routine without letting either fully take over, and then the front doors opened, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift in the air that made people pause without knowing why, and when she looked up, she saw him. Tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that seemed untouched by the storm outside, Adrian Volkov stepped in like the night belonged to him, his presence subtle but undeniable as conversations lowered and eyes turned away instinctively, and for a moment, just a second, his gaze lifted and met hers across the room. Steady, unreadable, as if he saw something no one else did, and Emily felt it, that strange pull, that awareness, before she quickly looked down, gripping the edge of a tray to ground herself, telling herself he was just another customer, just another man passing through her world. But something deep inside whispered otherwise, something quiet but certain, that tonight wasn't going to end the way she thought it would. Emily kept her head down, focusing on the tray in her hands, but she could still feel it, that quiet pressure in the air that had not been there before he walked in, like the room itself had shifted around him, and even though she told herself it did not matter, that he was just another man with money and a suit, her body refused to believe it as her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray and her breathing slowed into something more controlled, more careful, the way it always did when she sensed something unpredictable. The hostess guided him to a table near the center of the dining room, not the most private spot, not the most visible either, just enough space for someone who did not need attention but commanded it anyway, and he sat with a kind of stillness that made everything else feel louder, the clink of glasses, the scrape of chairs, the low hum of conversation, all of it orbiting around him without ever touching him, and Emily tried not to look, she really did, but her eyes betrayed her once, just a quick glance, and that was enough to catch the details she had missed before, the way his suit fit perfectly across his shoulders, the way his posture remained relaxed but alert, like someone who never truly let his guard down. She turned away quickly, moving toward another table, greeting customers, taking orders, slipping into the rhythm she knew by heart, but it felt different now, like she was moving through something fragile, something that could break if she made the wrong move, and then her phone buzzed softly in her apron pocket, a small sound that hit her like a shock, her entire body going still for half a second before she pulled it out just enough to see the screen, and her heart dropped. No name, just a number she knew too well, one she had tried to block more times than she could count. And for a moment she could not breathe, the noise of the restaurant fading into nothing as her thumb hovered over the screen, unsure whether ignoring it would make things worse or better, because it never really stopped him, it never had. She slipped the phone back into her pocket without answering, but the damage was already done, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up a glass of water and forced herself to keep moving, to keep working, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant fear creeping in where she could not control it. And across the room, Adrian Volkov watched without making it obvious, his gaze subtle, almost detached, but precise enough to catch the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her movements lost their earlier rhythm, and he did not ask, did not signal, did not interrupt, he simply observed. Like he was piecing together something from fragments no one else noticed. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time felt distorted, stretched thin between each step Emily took across the floor, until the front door opened again, and this time it was not quiet, not subtle, it was loud enough to turn heads, to break conversations, to pull attention in a way that felt sharp and immediate, and Emily froze before she even looked, because she already knew, her body recognized it before her mind could deny it. And when she finally turned, there he was, Ryan, standing just inside the entrance. Rain dripping from his jacket, eyes scanning the room until they found her, and in that moment everything else disappeared, the noise, the people, the safety she had tried to build for the night, all of it collapsing into a single point of fear as he took a step forward, and across the room. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, something colder, sharper, as if the night had just given him a reason to act. Emily could not move at first, her body locked between instinct and fear as Ryan stepped further into the restaurant, shaking rain from his jacket like he had all the time in the world, like he had every right to be there, and the worst part was not the noise he made or the way people stared, it was the certainty in his expression. The way he looked at her as if nothing had changed, as if she had never tried to leave. Her fingers tightened around the tray until the glassware rattled softly, a small, fragile sound that felt too loud in her ears, and she forced herself to breathe, one slow inhale, one steady exhale, telling herself to stay calm, to not give him what he wanted, but her feet betrayed her, taking a step back before she could stop them, and that was enough. Ryan saw it, that flicker of fear, and his lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something that meant he understood exactly how much control he still had. Conversations around them dropped into uneasy silence, people pretending not to watch while clearly watching everything, and Emily felt exposed in a way she had tried so hard to avoid, her safe space dissolving under the weight of his presence as he moved closer, each step unhurried, deliberate, until he was only a few feet away, close enough that she could hear his voice when he spoke. Her name, low, familiar, like nothing had ever gone wrong, like he had not been the reason she drove through the rain with shaking hands just an hour ago, and for a moment she said nothing, because anything she said would give him something to hold on to, and she refused to give him that, not here, not in front of everyone. Across the room, Adrian remained seated, but his attention sharpened, the stillness around him deepening rather than breaking, as if the entire situation had narrowed into something precise and calculated. He did not rush, did not interrupt, but his gaze followed every movement, every shift in Emily's posture, every inch Ryan closed between them, and something about that quiet observation felt heavier than action, like he was deciding something that had not yet been spoken. Ryan reached out, not forcefully, but with that same casual confidence that had always unsettled her, his hand hovering near her arm as if testing boundaries that he believed still belonged to him, and Emily flinched before contact could even happen, stepping back again, her voice finally finding its way out, soft but firm, telling him to leave, telling him this was not the place, not tonight, not ever again. And for a second, just a second, something flickered in his eyes, irritation, maybe surprise, but it passed quickly, replaced by something calmer, more controlled, as if he was adjusting his approach, playing a longer game. The air felt tighter, thinner, every second stretching into something fragile, and then it shifted, not because Ryan moved, but because someone else did, a chair sliding back, a subtle sound that cut through everything else, and when Emily's eyes lifted without meaning to, she saw Adrian standing now. His posture unchanged, his expression unreadable, but his presence impossible to ignore. He did not look at Ryan immediately, he looked at her first, just for a moment, as if confirming something, and then his attention moved, steady and precise, settling on the man who had just walked into her life again like he had never left, and in that instant, something unspoken passed through the room, something that made even the quietest voices stop completely, as if everyone sensed that whatever came next would not follow the rules they understood, and Emily felt it too, that shift, that irreversible moment where control was no longer hers to fight for or lose, but something else entirely. No one raised their voice, yet the tension in the room tightened like a held breath as Adrian took a single step forward, slow and deliberate, the kind of movement that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway, and Ryan noticed, of course he noticed, his focus shifting away from Emily for the first time since he walked in, his expression flickering with something uncertain as he looked at the man approaching him, trying to measure him, trying to understand why the entire atmosphere had just changed without a single word being spoken. Emily stood frozen between them, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might give her away, her instincts screaming to move, to step back, to disappear into the background where she belonged, but her body refused to cooperate, caught in the gravity of something she could not yet define as Adrian stopped just close enough to be part of the moment but not close enough to invade it. His presence calm, controlled, as if he had stepped into a situation he already understood completely. For a second, no one spoke, and in that silence, the smallest details became impossible to ignore, the faint drip of rainwater from Ryan's jacket onto the polished floor, the distant hum of a refrigerator in the kitchen, the quiet shift of someone at a nearby table pretending not to watch, and then Adrian's voice broke through, low and even, carrying no urgency, no anger, just certainty, as he addressed Ryan like a man speaking to another man who had already made a mistake, asking a simple question that felt anything but simple, something about whether he was supposed to be there, something that sounded almost polite but carried a weight that made Ryan hesitate before answering. Emily had never seen that before, not from him, not from anyone, that brief pause where control slipped just enough to be noticed, and it unsettled her more than anything else, because it meant this moment was no longer predictable, no longer following the pattern she had learned to survive, and Ryan recovered quickly, of course he did, his posture straightening, his tone shifting into something defensive but controlled as he responded, insisting that this was none of anyone else's business. That he was here to talk to her, that it was between them, and the word them hung in the air like something fragile, something that no longer belonged. Adrian did not react immediately, did not interrupt, he simply listened, his gaze steady, as if allowing Ryan to finish was part of a decision already made, and when he finally spoke again, it was quieter than before, but somehow more final, the kind of tone that did not argue, did not negotiate, just redirected the reality of the situation in a way that left no room for misunderstanding, and Emily felt it, that shift, like the ground beneath her had changed without warning, because for the first time since Ryan walked in, she was no longer the center of his attention, no longer the one carrying the weight of the moment alone. Something passed between the two men then, not visible, not dramatic, but undeniable, and whatever it was, it ended with Ryan taking a small step back, not forced, not pushed, just a decision he made on his own. And that alone felt impossible, Emily's breath catching as she watched it happen, her mind struggling to catch up with what her eyes were seeing, because this was not how things were supposed to go, not with him, not ever. Adrian did not follow, did not press, he simply stood where he was, his presence enough, his silence louder than anything else in the room, and after a moment that felt longer than it was, Ryan exhaled sharply, muttered something under his breath that no one needed to hear, and turned toward the door, his steps quicker now, less certain, until he disappeared back into the rain the same way he had come in, leaving behind a room that slowly remembered how to breathe. Emily remained where she was, unable to move, her hands still trembling slightly as the reality of what had just happened settled over her, and when she finally looked up again, Adrian was already watching her, not with triumph, not with expectation, but with something quieter, something that felt like a promise she had not asked for, and that was the moment she realized the night was not over, not even close. The room slowly returned to life, but it did not feel the same. Conversations resumed in cautious tones, glances lingered a second too long before looking away, and Emily stood there as if time had forgotten to move her forward, her fingers still curled slightly as if she was holding on to something that was no longer there, her breath uneven as she tried to understand what had just happened, because nothing about it made sense. Not the way Ryan had stepped back, not the way he had left without pushing further, not the way everything had shifted the moment Adrian chose to stand. She forced herself to move, to do something normal, anything that resembled the routine she depended on, and she turned toward the nearest table, her steps careful, measured, like she was relearning how to walk in a place that suddenly felt unfamiliar, her voice quiet but steady as she asked if they needed anything else, pretending nothing had happened while knowing everyone had seen enough to understand. Something had, and all the while she could feel it, that awareness, not heavy, not overwhelming, but present, Adrian's attention still on her, not intrusive, not demanding, just there, and it made her pulse quicken in a way she could not explain. she finished the interaction quickly and turned back toward the center of the room, her eyes betraying her again as they found him without intention, and he had not moved far. Still standing near where everything had unfolded, his posture unchanged. His expression calm, as if he had simply resolved a minor inconvenience rather than altered the course of her night, and for a moment she hesitated, unsure whether to approach or avoid him, because both felt like decisions that mattered more than they should, but before she could choose, he moved first, not toward her in a way that demanded attention, but with quiet intention, closing the distance just enough to stand within conversation, his presence steady, grounding in a way that confused her even more, when he spoke. His voice was low, controlled, carrying none of the tension that still lingered in her chest, asking a simple question about whether she was all right, and the simplicity of it caught her off guard, because no one had asked her that in a long time without expecting something in return, without attaching conditions to concern, and for a second she did not know how to answer, her instinct telling her to dismiss it, to say she was fine, to close the door before anything could enter, but something in his tone made that harder than usual, made the lie feel unnecessary, and she settled for something in between, a quiet acknowledgement that she was okay, or at least trying to be. Adrian studied her for a moment, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that suggested he was listening to more than just her words, noticing the slight tremor in her hands, the tension in her shoulders that had not yet faded. And then he reached into his jacket, pulling out a simple card, placing it on the edge of a nearby table rather than handing it to her directly, as if giving her the choice to take it or leave it without pressure, his voice just as calm as before as he told her that if the man returned, she would not have to handle it alone, and the words settled differently than anything else that night, not loud, not dramatic, but certain in a way that felt both reassuring and unsettling at the same time. Emily looked at the card but did not pick it up immediately, her mind racing through possibilities she did not want to consider, because accepting help had never been simple. It always came with something attached, something unseen that revealed itself too late, and she had learned that lesson the hard way. Yet as she stood there, with the memory of Ryan stepping back still fresh, with the echo of Adrian's quiet authority still lingering in the air, she felt something unfamiliar begin to take shape, something fragile and cautious, like the first hint of relief she had not allowed herself to feel in years, and when she finally reached for the card, her fingers brushed against it lightly, as if testing whether it was real, whether this moment was something she could trust, and as she slipped it into her apron, she realized that whatever line she had just crossed, there was no stepping back from it now. Emily kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant questioning the one decision she had just made, her fingers brushing lightly against the card in her apron every few minutes as if confirming it was still there, still real, while the rest of the shift unfolded in a strange blur of normalcy that did not feel normal at all. Orders came and went, plates were cleared, conversations rose and fell, but underneath it all there was a quiet tension she could not shake, like the night had already changed direction and everything else was just catching up. She avoided looking toward Adrian's table more than necessary, but every time she passed through the center of the room she could feel it, that steady awareness, not watching in a way that demanded anything from her, just present, like a constant she had not expected to exist, and it unsettled her because it was not control, not the kind she knew how to resist. It was something quieter, something that left space for her to choose, and she did not know what to do with that. Hours passed slowly until the crowd thinned, chairs emptied, and the noise softened into something manageable again, the kind of quiet that usually brought her relief, but tonight it only made her more aware of everything that had happened, every second replaying in fragments she could not fully piece together, and when she finally stepped into the back room to check her phone, her hands trembled slightly as she pulled it out, the screen lighting up to reveal missed calls, messages she did not open, and for a moment she just stared at it, her chest tightening as old patterns threatened to pull her back in, telling her to respond, to explain, to fix something that had never been hers to fix. But then her fingers tightened around the device and she turned it off instead, a small act, but one that felt heavier than it should. When she stepped back into the main room, Adrian was standing near the exit now, as if he had been waiting for something without making it obvious, and their eyes met again, not by accident this time, not fleeting, but steady, intentional. And for a second she hesitated, unsure whether to acknowledge him or continue past like nothing had changed, but something in his expression, calm, patient, made it clear that the choice was still hers, that he would not step forward unless she allowed it, and that realization shifted something inside her, something subtle but important. She walked toward him slowly, not because she felt obligated, but because she needed to understand, needed to place him somewhere in her world where things made sense. And when she stopped a few feet away, the silence between them felt different from before, less tense, more grounded, as if the storm outside had moved further away. Adrian spoke first, his voice low, steady, asking if she had someone waiting for her, if she would be safe leaving alone, and the question lingered longer than expected because safety had never been a simple answer, not for her, not in the life she had been trying to hold together, and she hesitated before answering, choosing her words carefully, admitting that she would manage, that she always did, even if the truth felt less certain now. Adrian did not challenge her, did not argue, he simply nodded once, as if accepting her answer without needing to change it, but then he added something quieter, something that settled deeper than anything else he had said, telling her that managing was not the same as being safe, and that if she changed her mind, the option she held in her apron was not temporary, not limited to tonight. Emily felt that again, that strange pull between relief and caution, her instincts warning her to step back, to keep distance from anything that felt too controlled, too powerful, but at the same time, something inside her recognized the difference, the absence of pressure, the space to decide, and as she stood there, listening to the faint sound of rain outside and the quiet rhythm of a night that refused to return to normal, she realized that for the first time in a long time, the next move was hers to make, even if she was not ready to admit what that meant. The rain had not stopped when Emily finally stepped outside, the night air colder now, quieter, the kind of silence that usually brought relief but tonight only made everything feel too exposed, too open, as if the world beyond the restaurant doors had been waiting for her to return to it. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, instinctively glancing across the parking lot before taking a step forward, her breath catching slightly when she realized how automatic that movement had become. How deeply fear had woven itself into every decision she made, even now, even after what had just happened, and for a moment she stood there, hesitating, the card in her apron suddenly feeling heavier than before, like a choice she had not fully accepted yet. Behind her, the door opened again, not abruptly, not in a way that startled her, but enough to remind her she was not alone, and she turned just slightly, enough to see Adrian step out into the rain without hesitation, as if the weather did not touch him the same way it touched everyone else, his presence calm, unchanged, and for a second she wondered if he had followed her intentionally or if he simply moved through the world without adjusting for anything at all. He did not close the distance between them immediately, did not invade the space she had created, but he did not leave either, and that alone made her pause, her instincts uncertain how to respond to something that did not demand or pressure, something that simply existed and waited. The parking lot lights flickered faintly overhead, casting soft reflections across the wet pavement as Emily finally took a few steps forward, her shoes echoing lightly against the ground, and she could feel it again, that awareness, not fear this time, not exactly, but something close to it, something that came from not knowing what would happen next, from standing at the edge of a situation that no longer followed the rules she understood. She reached her car and stopped, her hand hovering over the door handle as she looked out across the empty lot, her mind racing through possibilities she did not want to consider, the silence stretching longer than it should until Adrian's voice broke through again, quieter this time, closer than before but still measured, asking a simple question about whether she wanted him to stay until she left, and the offer settled between them in a way that felt different from everything else, not controlling, not commanding, just present. Like an option she could take or refuse without consequence. Emily did not answer immediately, her gaze fixed ahead as she tried to understand why that question mattered so much, why it felt like more than just concern, because accepting it meant acknowledging something she had spent years avoiding, the idea that she might not be able to handle everything on her own, that she might need someone else in ways she had taught herself not to allow, and that realization was more unsettling than anything Ryan had done that night. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool air as she finally turned slightly toward him, her voice quiet but steady as she told him she would be fine, that she appreciated it but she could manage, and even as she said it, she was not sure if it was entirely true anymore. Adrian studied her for a moment, not challenging, not dismissing, just listening, and then he gave a small nod, accepting her words without pressing further, but before stepping back, Before leaving her to the night she had chosen to face alone, he added something that lingered longer than anything else he had said, telling her that being fine and being safe were not always the same thing, and that sometimes the difference only became clear too late, and then he stepped away, not turning his back fully, not leaving entirely, just enough distance to give her the illusion of control, and as Emily finally opened her car door and slid inside, her hands resting on the steering wheel as the engine started softly beneath her, she realized that the quiet of the night no longer felt empty. It felt watched, not in a way that threatened her, but in a way that made her question whether she was truly alone anymore, and as she pulled out of the parking lot, the reflection of a dark figure remained in her rearview mirror for just a second longer than it should have, steady, unmoving, like a promise she had not yet decided to believe. The road stretched ahead of Emily in long, wet reflections of streetlights, each mile pulling her further from the restaurant but not from the feeling that something had shifted in her life in a way she could not undo, her hands steady on the steering wheel even as her thoughts refused to settle, replaying every moment from earlier, the way Ryan had looked at her, the way he had stopped, the way Adrian had not raised his voice yet somehow changed everything, and it did not make sense, none of it did, because men like Ryan did not stop, they did not step back, not unless something forced them to, and yet there had been no scene, no escalation, just a quiet ending that felt more final than anything loud ever could have been. She turned onto her street, slower now, more cautious, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings with a new kind of awareness, noticing shadows she had learned to ignore, parked cars that felt closer than before, the soft hum of a distant engine that might have meant nothing or everything, and when she finally pulled into her usual spot, she did not turn off the engine right away, her fingers resting lightly against the wheel as she looked toward the small apartment building that held everything she cared about, everything she had been trying to protect, her son sleeping peacefully upstairs, unaware of how close things had come to unraveling again, the card in her apron pressed faintly against her side, and for the first time since she had taken it. She reached for it, pulling it out slowly, her eyes tracing the simple design, the name printed cleanly across the surface, Adrian Volkov, nothing more, no explanation, no title, just a name that now carried weight she could not ignore, and she turned it slightly between her fingers, as if it might reveal something else if she looked long enough, but it did not, it remained exactly what it was, an option, a line she could cross or walk away from, and the choice felt heavier than she expected. She finally turned off the engine and stepped out into the quiet night, locking the car behind her before moving quickly toward the entrance, her steps light but purposeful, her instincts still alert, still searching for something that might be out of place, but the street remained still, unchanged, almost too normal after everything that had happened, and that normalcy made her uneasy, because she had learned that calm could be misleading, that silence could hide more than noise ever did. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and warm air, familiar, grounding, and she exhaled softly as she climbed the stairs, each step bringing her closer to the only place she allowed herself to feel safe, even if that safety had always been fragile, conditional, something she had to protect constantly, and when she reached her door, she paused for just a second, listening, her breath held as she pressed her ear lightly against the wood, waiting for any sound that did not belong, but there was nothing, just quiet, steady, reassuring in a way she needed more than she wanted to admit. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it carefully behind her before leaning against it for a moment, her eyes closing as she let the silence settle around her, real this time, not forced, not fragile, just present, and she allowed herself to breathe, to exist in that space without tension for the first time all night. Her son slept peacefully in the next room, the soft rhythm of his breathing reaching her faintly through the doorway, and that sound anchored her completely, reminding her why she had left, why she kept moving, why she could not afford to make the wrong choice now, and yet as she stood there, the card still in her hand, Adrian's voice echoed in her mind, quiet but certain, the difference between being fine and being safe, and she realized she no longer knew which one she was choosing, or if she had ever truly been either. Sleep did not come easily that night, even after Emily checked on her son twice, adjusting the blanket around his small frame and brushing a strand of hair from his forehead as if those quiet gestures could keep the world outside from reaching him. She lingered in the doorway longer than usual, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, grounding herself in it before finally stepping back into the dim light of the living room where everything felt too still, too quiet, the kind of silence that left room for thoughts she had been avoiding. The card rested on the small kitchen counter where she had placed it without thinking, its presence subtle but impossible to ignore, and she found herself looking at it more than once, each glance pulling her attention back no matter how hard she tried to focus on something else, the dishes in the sink, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing outside. None of it held her attention the way that single name did. Adrian Volkov, a stranger who had stepped into her life for less than an hour and somehow changed the direction of it. She moved toward the counter slowly, almost cautiously, as if getting too close might force her to make a decision she was not ready for, her fingers resting against the edge as she stared down at the card, her thoughts circling the same question she could not answer: what did he really want? Because nothing in her experience had ever been given without expectation, without cost, and even though he had not asked for anything, had not implied anything, that absence itself made her wary, made her question whether she was missing something hidden beneath the surface. She picked it up again, turning it slightly in her hand, feeling the smooth texture beneath her fingertips, and for a moment she considered calling, just to hear his voice again, just to understand what kind of man could walk into a situation like that and leave it quieter than before. But the thought alone made her chest tighten, because calling meant stepping into something unknown, something she might not be able to step back from once she crossed that line. She set the card down again, more firmly this time, as if deciding that distance was still the safer choice, that whatever he represented was too unpredictable, too powerful, and she had spent too long trying to build a life that depended on stability, no matter how fragile it was. And yet even as she turned away, her mind refused to settle, returning again and again to the moment Ryan had stepped back, to the way everything had shifted without force, without confrontation, and it did not feel like coincidence. It felt intentional, precise, like something had been handled in a way she did not fully understand. The clock on the wall ticked softly as minutes passed, stretching into something heavier. And Emily finally sank down onto the edge of the couch, her hands clasped loosely in her lap as she stared ahead without really seeing anything, her thoughts drifting between fear and something else she could not quite name, something that felt dangerously close to relief, and that was what unsettled her the most, because relief meant she had needed help, and needing help meant admitting she had not been as in control as she had believed. Outside, the rain had slowed to a faint drizzle, tapping lightly against the window like a reminder that the storm had not fully passed, and as Emily sat there in the quiet, she realized that the real question was not whether Adrian could protect her, it was whether she was willing to accept what that protection might mean, and whether walking away from it was truly safer than stepping toward it. And as that thought settled in, heavy and unresolved, she understood that the choice she was trying to avoid was already beginning to shape everything that came next. Morning came too quickly, the gray light slipping through the thin curtains before Emily felt ready to face it, her body heavy from a night that had offered little rest, her mind still tangled in thoughts that refused to settle, and for a moment she lay still, staring at the ceiling as if the answers might be written there, as if clarity might come with daylight. But nothing had changed, the same questions lingered, the same uncertainty pressed quietly against her chest. The soft sound of movement from the next room pulled her back, grounding her in something real as her son stirred awake, his small footsteps padding lightly across the floor before he appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, his presence simple and steady in a way that reminded her why she could not afford to hesitate too long, why every decision carried weight beyond just her own life. She pushed herself up, forcing a small smile as she greeted him, moving through the morning routine with practiced ease. Pouring cereal, checking his backpack, tying his shoes, each action familiar enough to quiet the noise in her head, if only for a little while, but even then, the card remained where she had left it on the counter, visible, waiting, and every time her eyes drifted toward it, she felt that same pull, that same quiet pressure to decide. She dropped her son off at daycare just before 8, watching him disappear through the door with a wave that lingered in her mind even as she walked back to her car, the world outside already moving forward as if nothing had changed, as if last night had not shifted something fundamental in her life, and yet she felt it, in the way she scanned her surroundings more carefully, in the way her shoulders tensed at the sound of a car door closing nearby, in the way her thoughts kept circling back to one name she had not expected to matter, the drive to work felt longer than usual, each stoplight stretching time just enough for doubt to creep back in, telling her to forget it, to let the night fade into something distant, something that did not need to follow her into today, but the memory refused to settle, the image of Ryan stepping back, the calm certainty in Adrian's voice, the way everything had shifted without explanation, it all stayed with her, persistent, impossible to ignore. When she pulled into the restaurant parking lot, the daylight made everything look smaller, less dramatic than it had under the storm, but the feeling remained, quiet and steady, like something waiting just beneath the surface, and as she stepped out of her car, she paused for a second longer than necessary, her hand resting against the door as she looked around, half expecting something to be different, something to confirm that last night had not been imagined, but the lot was empty, still, offering no answers. Inside, the routine resumed, the familiar rhythm of preparation, the scent of coffee brewing, the low chatter of co-workers settling into their shifts, and Emily moved through it all with the same quiet focus she always had, but beneath it, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, a sense that she was no longer moving through the same life she had been in yesterday. And as she tied her apron and reached into the pocket out of habit, her fingers brushed against something that should not have been there, something she had been certain she left behind, and when she pulled it out, her breath caught, because the card was there, the same simple design, the same name, Adrian Volkov, and for a moment she just stared at it, confusion giving way to something else, something deeper, because she knew she had placed it on the counter, she remembered it clearly, and yet somehow it had followed her here, or perhaps she had brought it without realizing, and that thought settled heavier than anything else, because it meant that whether she admitted it or not, the choice she thought she had postponed was already moving forward without her, already shaping the path ahead in ways she could no longer ignore. Emily stood there for a moment longer than she should have, the card resting in her palm as the quiet hum of the restaurant carried on around her, unchanged, unaware, but to her it felt like everything had shifted again, not outside, not visibly, but somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to ignore, because she could not explain how it had ended up in her apron. And the lack of explanation unsettled her more than if she had simply forgotten, because forgetting would have meant control, and this did not feel like control, it felt like something else moving alongside her choices. She closed her fingers around the card slowly, her breath steady but her thoughts anything but, and slipped it back into her pocket, this time with intention, not by accident, not by habit, but as if acknowledging that it belonged there now, whether she wanted to admit it or not. The morning moved forward in fragments, orders called out, coffee poured, plates arranged with practiced precision, and Emily followed the rhythm without missing a step, her movements automatic, efficient, but her awareness sharper than it had been before, noticing everything, the tone of voices, the way people entered and left, the subtle shifts in the room that she might have overlooked yesterday, because something inside her had changed, something that made her more alert, more aware of the spaces between moments. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket and her body reacted instantly, a reflex she had not yet unlearned, her hand moving before she could stop it, pulling it out just enough to check the screen, but this time there was no familiar number, no message waiting to pull her back into something she had fought to leave behind, just a blank notification that faded as quickly as it appeared, and she exhaled quietly, realizing how tightly she had been holding on to that tension, how ready she had been for it to return. She moved toward the window near the front of the restaurant, wiping down a table that did not need it, her gaze drifting outside without fully focusing, and for a second, just a second, she thought she saw something, a dark car parked across the street where it had not been before, its windows tinted just enough to obscure the inside, and her breath caught slightly, her mind racing to connect it to something real, something she could understand, but before she could decide whether it mattered, a customer called her name and the moment slipped away, leaving behind only a trace of unease she could not fully explain. She turned back to her work, but the image lingered, the sense that she was no longer moving unnoticed through her own life, that something had shifted beyond just her perception, and as the minutes stretched into something heavier, she reached into her apron again, her fingers brushing the edge of the card, grounding herself in its presence, in the one thing that felt certain in a night and a morning full of questions. She had told herself she would not call, that distance was safer, that stepping into something unknown was a risk she could not afford, but as she stood there, caught between routine and the quiet pull of something she did not understand, she realized that the decision was no longer as simple as it had been before. Because last night had already proven one thing she could not ignore, that staying alone did not guarantee safety, and for the first time, the idea of reaching out did not feel like weakness, it felt like a possibility she had been too afraid to consider, and as that thought settled in, quiet but persistent, she knew that whatever came next would depend on whether she was ready to stop running and start choosing something different. The decision did not come all at once, it settled slowly, like something inevitable she had been circling since the moment she stepped out into the rain the night before, and Emily felt it building quietly beneath the surface as the day moved forward, each small moment adding weight to a choice she could no longer pretend was distant, because ignoring it had not made it disappear, it had only made it clearer. She finished clearing a table near the window, her movement steady but deliberate, her thoughts no longer scattered but narrowing towards something specific, something she had been avoiding since she first saw his name printed on that card, and without giving herself too much time to reconsider, she reached into her apron and pulled it out again, holding it between her fingers as if grounding herself in its simplicity, because it was just a name, just a number, nothing more, and yet it carried a gravity she could feel even now. Her phone rested in her other hand, the screen dark for a moment before she tapped it awake, her reflection faintly visible against the glass, her expression more certain than she expected, and for a second she hesitated, not because she doubted the choice, but because she understood it, understood that this was the point where things shifted from thought to action, from possibility to reality, and once that line was crossed, there would be no pretending it had not happened. She entered the number slowly, carefully, as if each digit carried meaning beyond itself, and when the full sequence appeared on the screen, she paused again, her thumb hovering just above the call button, her heartbeat steady but stronger than before, echoing faintly in her chest as she let one breath pass, then another, giving herself one final moment to step back if she needed to, but she did not move, she did not turn away, and after a quiet second that felt longer than it should, she pressed the call button. The sound of the line connecting filled the space around her, soft but undeniable, each ring stretching time in a way that made her more aware of everything, the quiet hum of the restaurant, the distant clatter of dishes, the low murmur of voices that seemed far away now, and she found herself holding her breath without realizing it, waiting for something she could not fully predict, until the ringing stopped. There was no immediate response, no rushed greeting, just a brief silence on the other end, controlled, measured, and then his voice, calm, unmistakable, as if he had been expecting this moment even if she had not, and the way he said her name was not surprised, not questioning, it was certain, like a detail he had already decided mattered. Emily felt something shift again, not fear this time, not hesitation, but something steadier, something that allowed her to speak without the uncertainty she had expected, her voice quiet but clear as she acknowledged that she had called, that she needed to understand what he had meant, what exactly he was offering, because she could not move forward without knowing what stood on the other side of this decision. There was no interruption, no attempt to redirect her question, just a brief pause that suggested consideration rather than avoidance, and when Adrian spoke again, his words were simple, precise, telling her that understanding did not come from distance, that if she wanted answers, she would need to step closer, not metaphorically, not in theory, but in reality, and he gave her a location, not demanding, not urgent, just stated as a fact, somewhere public, somewhere neutral, a place where she could choose to meet him or walk away entirely. Emily listened without speaking, the details settling into her mind with a clarity that left little room for doubt, and when the call ended, she lowered the phone slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window again, the world outside unchanged, moving forward as it always did, but inside her, something had shifted into place, something that felt less like uncertainty and more like direction, and as she slipped the card back into her apron, she realized that the next step was no longer a question. It was a choice she had already begun to make. Emily did not tell anyone she was leaving early, she simply moved through the final minutes of her shift with the same quiet efficiency she always had, finishing what needed to be done, setting things in order as if routine could steady the weight of what she had already set in motion, but beneath that calm, something had shifted, something more certain than before, and when she finally untied her apron and stepped outside, the air felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just clearer, like the moment she had been circling had finally arrived. The sky was overcast, the light muted, and the street stretched ahead in familiar lines that no longer felt entirely predictable, her car waiting where she had left it, unchanged, yet as she approached it, she paused for just a second, her hand resting against the door as her mind replayed his words, not dramatic, not persuasive, just precise, a location, a time, an option she had already begun to accept the moment she pressed call. The drive felt shorter this time, not because the distance had changed, but because her focus had, her thoughts no longer scattered between doubt and fear, but narrowed toward what came next, and as she followed the directions he had given her, the city shifted subtly around her, familiar streets giving way to quieter ones, less crowded, more deliberate, until she pulled up in front of a place that matched exactly what he had described, a small, understated cafe on the corner, nothing extravagant, nothing that drew attention, but something about it felt intentional, like a space chosen for clarity rather than impression. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her breath steady as she looked at the entrance, the glass reflecting the muted light of the afternoon, and for a second, she allowed herself to feel it, the weight of the choice she had made, not fear. Exactly, not anymore, but awareness, the understanding that this was not just a meeting, not just a conversation, but a step into something she could not fully define yet, something that would change the direction of her life whether she was ready for it or not. She stepped out of the car and crossed the short distance to the door, her movements calm, measured, not rushed, not hesitant, just intentional, and when she pushed it open, the soft sound of a bell marked her arrival, subtle but final. The kind of moment that divided before and after without needing to announce it. Inside, the cafe was quiet, a few scattered customers, low conversation, the faint scent of coffee and warm air wrapping around her as she took a step forward, her eyes scanning the space until they found him exactly where he said he would be, seated near the back, composed, still, as if he had been there long before she arrived, waiting without impatience, without urgency, just certainty. Adrian looked up as she approached, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, but his attention fully present, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just filled with the understanding that this was the moment everything shifted. Emily stopped a few feet away, her posture straight, her gaze steady as she met his eyes without looking away this time, because whatever came next, she would not step into it halfway, she would not hesitate the way she had before, and as she took the final step toward him, she realized something she had not allowed herself to admit until now, that she had not come here just for answers, she had come because part of her already believed them, already trusted the quiet certainty in his voice, the absence of pressure, the presence of something she had not felt in a long time. And as Adrian finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, welcoming without needing to say it directly, she understood that this was no longer about escaping what she had left behind, it was about choosing what she was willing to step into next, and that choice would define everything that followed.